So the title of the study today is "Does Jesus Understand My Family?" And because I think sometimes, well, especially non-Christian people that I would deal with, they have this idea that God is in heaven somewhere and not kind of in touch with things, kind of looks down from afar and hands on hips and kind of goes, "Oh dear, love them." What are they at, or what are they doing? Whereas Jesus walked amongst us, grew up in a family, had brothers and sisters, and all these sorts of things. And so I just wanted to go through some of the dynamics of that, and also in regard to where he grew up. So it's not only who he grew up with, but where he grew up and what sort of education did Jesus have when he was growing up, because all this kind of stuff impacts us. We assess people based on education. We assess people based on background. Because if I said, say, so and so came from West Belfast, the majority of you would go, "Oh," and you might, make an assertion. May not be based on anything, but just the sheer fact that you hear West Belfast or the Short Strand or something like, you end up sort of coming to certain kinds of conclusions about things. And so a lot of us have built-in prejudices. And that's one advantage I have seeing people here in Northern Ireland, is because I'm not from here. When they hear my name, Woody, they can't identify what side of the fence I'm from. And if they ask me, do I support a particular football club or something like that, I go, "I don't like football." And they go, "Oh." And then they'll ask me where I'm from or where I live. I say, "Well, I live in Banbridge," which is a pretty innocuous, sort of homogeneous kind of part of the world, So so as soon as they hear my accent, they go, "Oh, you're all right," So we'll trust you. Yeah. So yes, I've visited a good few people up the falls and all that sort of stuff, So yeah. So anyway, but does Jesus understand my family? So what I'm going to look at here is initially parents and guardians. Okay, and the reason I talk about parents and guardians is because Jesus did have parents, but one of those parents was actually just a guardian. Okay, it wasn't his parent. So let me just look at Matthew 1 and verse 24 to 25. And these are verses that are read every year at Christmas time. And, so we could probably quote these backward and forward. But anyway, it says, "Then Joseph, being aroused from sleep, did as the angel of the Lord commanded him, and took to him his wife," meaning Mary, "and did not know her till she had brought forth her firstborn son, and he called his name Jesus." So now the reason I have firstborn underlined there is because in a lot of the modern English translations, that ain't there. It just says that she had brought forth a son. Now that slightly dumbs down the virgin birth. Okay, because one thing that the Bible needs to make extremely clear is that Mary had a virgin birth. Okay, and that Christ did not have an earthly father. That has to be very, very clear. So now I would say that some of these translations, and these would be well-known ones, ESV, NIV, New American Standard, they all do this. This is the New King James, and the Authorized Bible, the King James Version, has firstborn son. Now, if you look in the Greek, there is this word for firstborn, which is prototokos. So it's proto and totokos. So proto meaning first. It's like prototype, It's and then the Tauticus is about birth. So, but the thing is, so let's get through a little bit. So Jesus' Father is God the Father. Okay, so that again, if you backpedal into the Christmas story, that is abundantly clear that the Lord had come upon Mary, and she was pregnant as a result of that, not by the intervention of an earthly man, because the sin is passed through the man, not through the woman. Now, Jesus' mother was Mary. Okay, that's clear. So, which means that Jesus' stepfather was Joseph. All right. So right off the bat, we have a dysfunctional home. Now, we don't like to use that terminology, because, we're like, ooh, we're talking about Jesus here. But, we're talking about a situation that is, for lack of a better term, unusual. All right. Now, and again, as the Bible is very particular in terms of its language, and it always refers to Mary as Christ's mother, but it never refers to Joseph as his father. So so at this point, Jesus was an only child, okay, and hence understood that. So I don't know if any of you come from an only child family. I don't. I was the second born in my house, but if you were an only child, Jesus understands this. So I don't know how long it was before Joseph and Mary had other children, but for some period of time, Jesus was the only one on the scene in terms of his family. So he was an only child, and he understands how to be the point of focus. Because a lot of children that are grown up as the only child, that's their experience. They go, my parents look, so I'm the only one. Okay, now Jesus was born into potential and likely scandal, though, because this was a big deal here, because Joseph was betrothed to Mary. That is a little stronger than an engagement, but it's not marriage. Okay, marriage doesn't come along until that's consummated at the wedding night and that kind of thing. So they hadn't got to that particular stage. Now Joseph, as the Bible says, being a just man, was minded to put Mary away. In other words, divorce her quietly. Could have had the right to put her away very publicly and had her stoned and all those sorts of things. But the angel came to him at night, and as it says there in that scripture, was being aroused from sleep, that did as the angel had commanded him, and took him as Mary, and did not know her until she had this firstborn son. So I would imagine that people in the community would have looked at this and raised eyebrows and go, so was it the milkman? Was it the coal man? Was it the postman? Was it, who was it? Or was it a Roman soldier? Or what happened here that this is kind of back to front? So Jesus is then, I would say, growing up with said cloud over his head, because now people don't understand what's going on, but they come to certain kinds of conclusions. So I would imagine, and there's going to be a verse that I'm going to highlight here that would suggest that this cloud kind of followed Jesus around. All right. But anyway, Jesus understands within this particular kind of context what it is to be an only child and what it is to grow up in a dysfunctional home with a lot of questions being asked. Scripture again here. So out of John 8, and they answered and said to him, Abraham is our father. And Jesus said to them, if you were Abraham's children, you would do the works of Abraham, but now you seek to kill me, a man who has told you the truth, which I heard from God. Abraham did not do this. You do the deeds of your father. Then they said to him, we were not born of fornication. We have one Father, God. And Jesus said to them, if God were your father, you would love me, for I proceeded forth and came from God, nor have I come of myself, but he sent me. Why do you not understand my speech? Because you are not able to listen to my word. You are of your father, the devil, and the desires of your father you want to do. He was a murderer from the beginning, and he does not stand in the truth because there is no truth in him. And when he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own resources, for he is a liar and the father of it. But because I tell the truth, you do not believe me. Which of you convicts me of sin? And if I tell the truth, why do you not believe me? He who is of God hears God's words. Therefore, you do not hear, because you are not of God. So now, a lot of people would use this passage basically to look at a discussion about who the devil is. Okay, but as Jesus is talking about the Pharisees saying Abraham's our father and so on and so forth, there is this insertion in verse 41 where it says, they said to him, we were not born of fornication. We have one Father, God. Now, that's a shot across Jesus' bow.
So we dig.
Yeah. And so I would say, and some of the things that are in the Bible may not be sort of direct and in your face, but anytime I've seen this passage, I go, they're remembering stories or some kind of black cloud that has kind of followed Jesus around in terms of reputation, and basically they're saying, we weren't born of fornication, sort of like other people we know. And so because the Pharisees were always looking for opportunities to try to shore themselves up and make themselves self-righteous. So,
and that's what people do. People, when they say they forgive people, that's grand until they do something.
Yeah.
And you get a moment like this.
Yeah.
Whereas whenever you get forgiveness from God, you get forgiveness from God.
Yep. So yeah, and Northern Ireland could write a book on casting out. So but the idea of casting up is not new. So Jesus, getting back to Jesus understands things. So Jesus understands that, albeit wrong reputation, nonetheless, it follows you around. So,
and it also shows you that when things are, and people will say everything's in the Bible, because it's a history book, and it's about truth and it's about fact. If you were writing that out, you would leave that out.
Sure.
You wouldn't put that in.
Yeah. So it is interesting, and a lot of the verses that we're going to be looking at actually are the type of verses that you and I would likely skip, or not skip, but just read and not really pay much attention to. So let's go and talk about who was in Jesus' family then. So it says in Matthew 13, 55 and 56. Now, this is a set of scripture that is wedged in between Jesus doing miracles and his discourses and things like that. There's these various cycles that take place within Matthew. And this is just kind of sits right in the middle somewhere, So, because in Matthew 13, there's a lot of parables, a lot of teaching. And then it's going to be going on to more, historical stories and different things. And what's said is this not the carpenter's son? is not his mother called Mary? And his brothers, James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas, and his sisters, are they not all with us? Where did this man get all these things? Now, in Mark 6, there is a similar statement. It says, is this not the carpenter? There's a slight difference here, because the one is talking about the carpenter's son, and then the other one is talking about the carpenter. So the son of Mary, and the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simeon, and are not his sisters here with us? So they were offended at him. So Jesus has had 4 named brothers and at least 2 sisters. Okay, so we have James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas. Okay, not to be confused with Judas Iscariot, obviously. Now, just to say that the James here wrote the book of James. So that was done by Christ's half brother. The book of Jude was written by Judas here. So the half brother of Christ. They eventually came to have faith in their brother as the Messiah, but that was not always the case. Okay. Now, the reason I say at least 2 sisters is because it says, and his sisters, that's plural. Okay, so that's at least 2. It's not 1. Okay. So that means Jesus had at least 4 half siblings. So he was the only child for some period of time, and then Joseph and Mary had 4 sons and at least 2 girls. Now, the Catholics would say that Mary was a perpetual virgin, never had children, aside from Christ. And what they would say when citing these particular verses is they would say, well, what the word brothers mean and sisters is cousins. Now, I'm sorry, that doesn't wash, okay? Because when you look at the Greek, at the word brothers, it talks about from the womb. So these are biological brothers, okay? Not cousins from afar. But the reason they say cousins is because that suits their narrative about Mary being a perpetual virgin. So
you start telling lies, you've got to pick up a whole lot of lies to cover your back. So that really looks like actually a dig too when it says, "Is this not the carpenter's son?" It doesn't mention Joseph by name. Right. And then the next one, is this not the son of Mary? Is that like a dig? Is this not the carpenter's son?
I'll go back to these verses again because there is a context where this sits. So I know what you're thinking there or saying, but now it is interesting that they don't mention Joseph by name. Now, that is interesting because Joseph isn't mentioned by name hardly at all. After Jesus is 12. Okay, when they go to Jerusalem and all that kind of thing, and then they're wondering where did Jesus go? And he was, back in Jerusalem, chatting with the Pharisees and all demons. And then Jesus put himself under the authority of Mary and Joseph, who were bringing them up. Okay, now after that, after the age of 12, you hear you hear nothing about Joseph really. Except him being referenced, I think in John somewhere. So Jesus has 4 named brothers, at least 2 sisters. So Jesus then understood what it was to have brothers and sisters. Okay, so since he was the oldest, he knew what it was to be an only child. Then all of a sudden we get a pile of kids, and so he gets it in terms of what it is to grow up in a family full of kids, brothers, sisters, and um, and all the dynamics that go along with that kind of thing. So now there was a family struggle though. Okay. And in John 7, 3 through 5, it says his brothers, meaning, uh, his four named brothers, therefore said to him, depart from here and go into Judea, that your disciples also may see the works that you are doing. For no one does anything in secret while he himself seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world, for even his brothers did not believe in him. Okay, so basically, Jesus at this particular point was demonstrating himself to be Messiah, demonstrating himself to be king, and now I would say Mary believed this because she pondered these things in her heart. She accepted the what was originally told her by Gabriel and so on, the angel. But in terms of the growing up and all that kind of stuff, because these other brothers and sisters and so on were by nature sinners, that the natural person does not accept the things of God, even though their half brother is the Christ himself. So, but so Jesus understands what it is then to be misunderstood, even within a family context. And how often have we been in a family where people go, I don't get you at all.
I wonder to myself, to use an Northern Ireland term, the brothers, you think the mother would have wondering when as they were growing up, and there would have been arguments, and nobody can answer this, like for everyone the way I'm asking it, but in a family you would get squabbles, and you get things like that. You'd like, would Mary take his part? Stick up for him, as we say in this country.
She would have beside you.
Yeah.
Obviously you, yeah.
Yeah.
And she may not have wanted to explain that to them, but
yes,
search some other.
Yeah, maybe she was like, boys, you don't get it. When you get older, you might, but leave them alone. Or
sometimes you get a mother and it's very obvious that she has a favourite. There's other ones would be a wee bit more discreet and would stick up for them, but there would be maybe. But you think to yourself, like, I mean, if that's going through them kids' heads, she knows that.
Yeah.
The facts.
Yeah. So it is just interesting these little dynamics here, because I would imagine that Jesus would have found this frustrating, sense human. It's like, I'd love for my brothers to get it, but they don't get it.
I know. You think Jesus might say to her, Mom, tell him the truth.
Yeah. Yeah.
And obviously she knew because she came in the Galilee.
Yeah.
The first miracle. She was the one that walked him into the miracle.
Yeah. So, and again, Joseph isn't about with that. Mary is. We haven't read the verses in and around this that where Mary is demonstrated herself, but it's almost like the brothers are like, you say you're the Messiah, right? Okay, well, you go and do these miracles, go and do these things, and show yourself to the world if that's what you're about, but Jesus is not interested in being a showman. Jesus is not interested in demonstrating himself to try to placate the world's curiosity. He came to deal with man's core issue, and that was a sinful heart. So
he defend himself, and there'd be right to.
Yeah. Oh, sure. And he could have said one word just to lay them all, but anyway, he returned it. But it is interesting, when you have and those of us that have maybe larger families or come from larger families, we know the struggle that there is being misunderstood, misinterpreted, or people siding with us or not siding, I've had three girls, and sitting around the table, somebody might say something and then they go, then the look, is it, it's just, for, curling up the eyebrows, and it's just deadly, and it just drills straight through you. And then, as the parent, you're going, it's watching ping pong and tennis and all this, but, but, Jesus was, probably the middle piece of discussion about this, it's like, and I would say too, because when Jesus was the age of 30, left the family business, and went out on this ministry, I would say the other brothers were like, you're the oldest brother here, you should be shoring up the family business, because, well, as we can see here, there's a big absence of Joseph. So who's carrying the can? Who's carrying the business and the family responsibility? Isn't that the older brother's gig? Not us. So maybe they're coming up and going, yeah, Jesus, get yourself back down here. So now, growing up in the wrong place. This is where Jesus grew up. Okay. So born in Bethlehem, had to be born in Bethlehem. Okay, because that's where the Messiah had to be born. He was at the city of David, all these things. However, that's not where they ended up living. Okay, Matthew 2:19-23, it says, now when Herod was dead, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, arise, take the young child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the young child's life are dead. And then he arose and took the young child and his mother, and they came into the land of Israel. But when they had heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judah instead of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there, and being warned by God in a dream, he turned aside into the region of Galilee, and he came and dwelt in a city called Nazareth, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophets, he shall be called a Nazarene. Now, Matthew is very, very careful in terms of, especially in the kind of Christmas narrative, in sharing messianic prophecies. So he was quoting very specifically from Isaiah and Micah and Zechariah, all these different prophets about where the Christ would be born, how that was all going to happen. Now, right at the end of chapter 2 of Matthew, we have this thing where it says that it might be spoken by the prophets, and then there's a quote, he shall be called Nazarene. Now, go find it. You won't find it. So, what's the problem? If there's a quote here, and he's quoting theoretically from the Old Testament, why can't you find it? Clue is in the word prophets, because it says that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophets. Okay, now, so what that means is that there was a theme in the prophets that said he would be called a Nazarene. Now, some people would look at, I think it's Isaiah 11:1, where it talks about the Messiah coming from the root of Jesse and would be a tender shoot. Now, the word for tender shoot is nizar, which some people kind of extract and they go, well, maybe this is a reference to a Nazarene because it looks kind of like the same sort of word. It means twig, means stick, not a big thing. So therefore, Nazareth was kind of a non-entity. It was a little dopey place or something. But it's a bit of a stretch, because this particular passage is not referring to a particular passage. Okay, it's not because otherwise Matthew would have said, as spoken by the prophet.
Or, but it could have, even the fact that it says spoken by the prophets or written in the prophets.
Yeah,
Is it possible that something could be spoken by the prophets,
but not written
but
down.
not written down
Yeah.
in a prophetic book?
Possibly. So, I would say,
Because you know the way the
Yeah.
Bible says, if everything was written down that Jesus would
yeah,
all the
well,
books
yes,
were complete.
this is true.
Yeah.
Now, I would say if the prophets, is a reference to, a particular body of work within the Tanakh, which was their Old Testament. So that when you talked about the prophets, you were talking about a range of material, written material. So I understand what you're saying, but I don't think it was just an oral tradition. It would have been a written down thing. But again, what Matthew is doing is he's looking at a theme. And so if you look at places like in Isaiah 53, it says things like he was despised and rejected of men. His man's sorrows, queen of grief, things like this. So, and there's other passages of scripture that would talk about the Messiah being rejected. And so now let's look at another verse of John here, where it says, Philip found Nathanael and said to him, we have found him of whom the Moses and the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. Now, obviously, Philip, his understanding of who Jesus is in terms of parental things is a little bit short-sighted, but anyway. And Nathanael said to him, can anything good come out of Nazareth? And Philip said to him, well, come and see. Now, why was Nazareth such a, bad place? Can anything good come out of Nazareth? So, it's like Nazareth has this lousy reputation, so, and so let's talk about Nazareth. Why was it why was it a bad place? So, and why did Jesus end up there? Okay, so what's wrong with Nazareth? Well, Nazareth was a Galilee backwater. Okay, it was about, I think about 15, 20 miles, maybe about away from the Sea of Galilee in the hills of that part of the world, which would have been a little bit north of Samaria. So it would have been that area that the Jews, if the Jews were heading north, they would have cut around Samaria to get to Galilee because there's a lot of Jews that lived up in that part of the world. But Nazareth really wasn't on a main road.
I remember being on a road looking down at Nazareth, and there was an old pathway between, it's not a pathway, but like a track.
Yeah.
And they were saying that whatever Jesus would have went from Nazareth to Galilee,
Yeah.
that quite possibly the road that he would have went.
Yeah.
And it was just like through McCartney's quarry.
Yeah. Yes, and it's just, there's no crack there. There's nothing there. Now, Nazareth today is a city of about 50,000 people. So it's in terms of Banbridge town is about 13,000, I think. So multiply that by 4 and you get a Nazareth sort of size of place. Now, pretty big, I guess. Sort of like the size of Lisbon or something. But again, off to the side, and the people that lived there, well, we'll find out what they were like. So really, it was the wrong side of the tracks, as we would say in America. So somebody who came from the wrong side of the tracks was, right.
You think that was a call from West Belfast, isn't it?
Yes, so it's and you could go into any town in Northern Ireland and find some place that you regard as the wrong side of the tracks. Now, the people who live there would say you come from the wrong side of the tracks. So it is interesting. Our subjectivity.
Yes.
So it was a small town. You know, and so it was an insignificant place. You know, why didn't Jesus and Mary and Joseph set up shop in Jerusalem? Sure, that's the city of the great king. You know, and now eventually Jesus kind of adopted Capernaum as kind of headquarters in Galilee, you know, which was a pretty major commerce sort of place. But in terms of where Jesus grew up and spent the majority of his life, it was in this dopey place. So they were said to have had a rude accent and dialect.
I mean,
I didn't say that. So, just for those online that didn't hear that, Kevin said, Ballymena.
you have to say, hey, after.
Okay. So, you know, or people from Cullymackey said it, and, or Hawthorne. You know, so, you know, and again, you know, you could go to any part of the world and even up in Belfast, you know, people would, you know, start giving off of that, you know, Helene does this wonderful BT9 accent, you know, of the Malone Road kind of crowd, you know, and so, but anyway, so, you know, so these people were known for this. They were known for a rude dialect, you know, probably that they couldn't be understood terribly well, you know, so, you know, more posh people would maybe, you know, if they went to Nazareth for whatever reason, they would go, pardon me, sorry, no, that's not the proper way to speak, you know, and so Jesus is growing up in this kind of environment. And who knows, maybe he got the accent. So, and they were also labeled as being uncultured. When you read about Nazareth and you go into the dictionaries about this, they would say it was uncultured. You know, they did that, you know. It's kind of funny, you know, I drive around all over Northern Ireland, and there are certain towns that you would go through, not name them, but anyway, you go through and you just go, can't wait to get through this. You know, and you see certain kinds of houses, you see certain kinds of shops, you see certain kind of boarded up shops with certain graffiti on them and all that kind of stuff, and you're just like, yeah, okay, we will get past this. You know, and so you know, and you do see people hanging about, and more than likely they're not working, you know, or something. You know, so you know. So Jesus gets this. He understands all this kind of cultural mess that we tend to live in and that we judge. They were also known for lacking morals and were considered irreligious. So, you know, who knows what kind of riffraff you found in Nazareth, you know, and people that really didn't give two hoots about God or that kind of stuff. So this is Nazareth, great place to grow up. So, but Jesus came to seek and to save that which was lost, and the people of Nazareth were Jesus type of people. You know, so I'm sure when Jesus was growing up, knowing his mission, you know, and working in the carpenter's shop, as it were, you know, there were people coming in and out that were as lost as could be and did not care. You know, they were just trying to get by. And Jesus had compassion, and he was going, I just love these people. They're my people. You know, and so, you know, could you imagine if Jesus grew up in the king's palaces and, you know, in the upper echelons of Jerusalem and, or whatever, you know, and, but Jesus wants to identify with, you know, those that are down and out, as it were. And I remember saying to people one time, I said, you know, because there were complaining, about certain people coming, into the gospel meeting or potentially coming into, they were saying, well, they're not dressed very well. They're not this, not that, the other thing. I said, well, what do you want? Clean sinners?
People who like questions.
Yeah, and, and what on earth is that?
Yeah.
So anyway, so we have the wrong side of the tracks here. Okay. Now this kind of then ventures into this issue of education and job. Okay, so let's look at Matthew 13 again, which we did look at. We'll look at the verses around it. And so it came to pass when Jesus had finished these parables that he departed from there. And when he had come to his own country, he taught. So this is Nazareth. He taught them in their synagogue, so that they were astonished and said, where did this man get this wisdom and these mighty works? Is this not the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary, and his brothers James, Joseph, Simon, Judas, and sisters, are they not with us? Where did this man get these things? So they were offended at him, but Jesus said to them, a prophet is not without honor except in his own country and house. Now, he did not do many mighty works there because of their unbelief. Let me just read Mark, because it's similar, but there are a few little differences. It says, then he went out from there and came to his own country, and his disciples followed him. And when the Sabbath had come, he began to teach in the synagogue. And many hearing him were astonished, saying, where did this man get these things? And what wisdom in which he was given to him, that such mighty works are performed by his hands? Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary, the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us? So they were offended at him. But Jesus said to him, a prophet is not without honor except in his own country, among his own relatives, and in his own house. Now he could do no mighty works there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people, healed them, and he marveled because of their unbelief. And then he went out about the villages in the circuit teaching. So interesting that he continued to go out, and he wasn't put off, by what they're saying. It's like, okay, I'm just going. Now you see the word marveled there in verse 6. There's 2 times in which the word marvel appears in regard to Christ in the Gospels. One is here, where he marvels at their unbelief. The other, he marvels at the faith of the centurion. Marveling is an interesting sort of word to me, because it means to be sort of taken aback. It was like, whoa, wow. That's pretty cool, and so Jesus is marveled at 2 extremes. One was the unbelief of those in Nazareth, and then the other was the belief and the trust that the centurion had. So now that's not the only time the word marvel happens in the Gospels, because you do hear about people marveling at what Jesus did and stuff. But so. Now, Jesus is, I talk about education and job here. So Jesus is, they're saying, where did this wisdom come from? So that means they're questioning his education. They're like, he's saying things that are right, but so where's his degree? Where's his paperwork? Where's his certificates? Where are these things coming from? And they say, is this not the carpenter? Or as the Matthew passage says, the carpenter's son? The word carpenter there does refer to a skilled labor, but nonetheless, it is associated with labor. So it's not somebody who is intellectual. So Jesus is coming from a background here, and either education or job experience that again is assessed and judged in a negative way. So basically, Jesus understands what it is to be judged about educational background. And Jesus understands what it is to be judged regarding job experience. You know, it's like, so Jesus is coming into ministry. You know, it should be somebody who's well-heeled, well-schooled, in biblical thought and teaching and all these kinds of things. Where did that come from? Sure, he's just a carpenter. You know, he shouldn't be doing this.
You think of working very first,
But yeah. So
wisdom.
you know, so you know, one of my preclusions in my own mind as I was called into the work of stars in terms of what I do, you know, Tom Eakin said to me, God is calling you into this work. And I said, no, he's not. He can't be. I don't come from this background. So I'm immediately then looking at experience, I'm looking at background, and I'm looking at education and going, well, I don't got that, so I'm not qualified to do what I'm doing. So, but yet God called me into the work. So if God calls you into the work, well, then by golly, God's going to equip you for the work. So, but Jesus gets this. Jesus understands when educational issues and job things are brought up. You know, so now that's not to say that education and job experience is bad. Okay, that's not bad. That's I think it can work in one's certainly favor. You know, one of the things that people criticize, say, Charlie Kirk about it, they've gone by, was he had a high school education and did not have a college degree. Now that was one of his points. Was to basically say, I don't have a degree, I don't have one of these scam things, and so and I get this. Yeah, I've been through university. I've been through secular university. I've been through Christian university. So I know when there's silly courses that you have to go and take. And that's a very American thing. Over in this part of the world, if you get a degree, you're generally taking lectures that are just germane to your degree. Okay. Over in America, half of what you take is garbage. So, but they want you to be a well-rounded individual. So you have to take humanities, languages, English, and history. All these sorts of things. Yeah, you do get to pick certain things, but I remember my economics teacher. Now I was a computer science and engineering student. Okay, so but you had to take an economics class for non-economics majors. So and the guy was quite good because he realized that everybody in the class didn't give a monkey's about economics. And but he made it fun. He made it really fun. He always finished his class 5 minutes before the end of the class. He would say, right, go talk about the bear. And so he would talk about this story, and then he would leave it on a cliff edge, the story. And he says, come back tomorrow. I'll tell you more. So the students would actually then come to hear about the bear. Not about economics.
Bears going to test them.
Yeah. So anyway, right. Let's just talk about what happened to Joseph. Okay. Now, again, you don't hear about Joseph after the age of 12 with Jesus. So there's the situation on the cross where Jesus then does this. It says, now there stood by the cross of Jesus his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene, so there's 3 Marys. When Jesus therefore saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing by, which was the Apostle John, and he said to his mother, woman, behold your son. And then he said to the disciple, behold your mother. And from that hour, that disciple took her into his own home. Now, if Joseph was about, he wouldn't have to do this. But he does it nonetheless. So Joseph was obviously dead at the time of the crucifixion. of Jesus. So he may have died either in Jesus' late teens or 20s. Because the only reason that Jesus said this at the cross was because Joseph was not there to take care of Mary. So he then instructed the Apostle John to take care of his mother. Because back then, if your husband passed away, economically, you were sort of up a creek. So, and because when Jesus went to the city of Nain to raise the son up, the son was the only son of the mother who was a widow. Okay, that was just an economic disaster there because the older son was dead and the mother was left behind, so there was just the economy that was just bad. So here Jesus is actually dealing with this. He's dealing with Mary's economic welfare from the cross. I mean, can you imagine that?
We obviously not.
Yes, he's not concerned about himself.
Concerned about his mom.
Yeah. So and he takes care of it, So now, so what this suggests then is Jesus understands what it is to be in a single parent home and take responsibility. Now, there may be some of us that have come from single parent situations. Whether you yourself had a spouse that has passed away, or you grew up in a home where the parents divorced or something. When I grew up, my mother died when I was 15. My dad got remarried. So I was in a very functional home and I got immediately propelled into a dysfunctional situation. Now, I had two parents, but, from my perspective, only my dad's alive. Yes, there's the stepmother there, but she's not your mom. So now she didn't pretend to be, she didn't, I called her by her first name, all that kind of thing, so, but, and we got on fine, so, but, if you can understand the emotional dynamics, let's say that Joseph, passed away when Jesus was 20 or something like that, that would have been 10 years prior to his entry into ministry, he would have been 10 years at the helm of his family.
Breadwinner. He would have been the breadwinner.
Yeah, obviously. So, and can you imagine the emotional needs of the siblings? Because a lot of times, the daughters, get locked in behind the dad. And the sons get locked in behind the mother, quite often that's how that works. So the two sisters that Jesus had probably were revenant, because their dad was dead. So he had to stand in and, take on that role. But, as it says there in Matthew 11, Jesus' heart was gentle and lowly. He didn't push himself. He wanted to promote good things. I've seen situations where older sons or older, they step into the breach, and then they tend to, because of inexperience and things like that, they tend to lord it over the family. Then it's like, right, okay, I'm in charge now. It's me, here I am, and because of inexperience, then it becomes worse in other ways. So, so I find that an interesting sort of dynamic to consider. So basically, last slide here. Jesus understands me. So Jesus understands family dynamics, its hazards, its pressures. Jesus understands misunderstanding. Jesus understands being associated with a place and how that can be interpreted, kind of like guilty by association. Jesus understands educational and vocational prejudice. If Jesus understands, then it can help me. So, and I think, in a lot of ways, you would probably miss this kind of discussion looking at Bible verses, because those verses we looked at, you wouldn't look at them necessarily from that point of view. But sometimes that's what you have to do with the scriptures, is you have to take an idea and go, okay, how was Jesus' family? What were the struggles and dynamics there? You know, and obviously they exist. You know, they're not laid out, you know, maybe in a very detailed sort of way, but you know, we all come from families and stuff like that, and we can just imagine sort of what that's like. But you know, for me, that means, you know, I can go to Jesus in prayer and say, Jesus, you understand me, you get me.
Do you know the amazing thing too? I look at that and think to myself, he put himself in a position to be in those situations. Whereas if you're in a dysfunctional family, or I don't necessarily want to be there,
Yeah,
and I would be out of it if I could get
Yeah.
the opportunity to get it.
yeah,
But when you think of what he came from
yeah.
and allowed himself to be all those things,
Mhm.
It's just like, there's no word.
he understands you more than
Yeah. So,
And yet, at the age of 12, he was in the temple. Confounding the greatest minds of the day.
yeah.
So that's impossible in human terms.
Mhm.
Absolutely impossible.
Mhm. Yeah. So,
What's worse, true.
That's very interesting, that period between 12 and he's 30 was out of his ministry.
yeah.
We'll
Yeah.
never find out till we're in heaven.
No, we'll not find out until we actually, actually get there, you know, because all we know in terms of after that point of being 12, it says that Jesus put himself under the authority of Mary and Joseph, and he grew in stature and in wisdom, both in the favor with God and man. So what that would suggest is that that Jesus grew physically, he grew in stature, he grew in wisdom, so he grew intellectually, you know, as a human, okay? So as God, of course, he has all knowledge, but as a human, he had to grow. So he grew in wisdom, he grew in favor with God, which means that he grew spiritually, and then favor with man, which is he grew socially. So there was so there was those four fronts of physical things, intellectual things, spiritual things, and societal things. You know, that he grew up with, and at the right time, and the right age, then that's where he entered into ministry.
But from the age of 12 then up until the banks of the Jordan, there's not much actually recorded about the life of Christ.
No, and that's what I'm telling you, is those four things. Okay, that's it. So, but Jesus in human terms had to be prepared in that fashion, so that at the age of 30, and that's when you know, rabbis did start their journeys with people. So that, you know, so that the age of 30 was not a just a number out of the air. You know, that was a common thing, the age of 30. So, but yet over the period of 3 years of Jesus' ministry, Jesus turned the world upside down.
I'm a cracking ceremony from a Jewish male boy wasn't responsible for the law until he turned 12.
That's correct.
Right, so that's what Jesus was up in the temple when he turned 12,
Yeah.
because he had come of age.
Yeah, and that's you know, even in our day and age, when Jewish boys have bar mitzvahs, you know, that's at the age of 12. That's when they become men.
I think Paul makes reference to it somewhere, where he said he didn't know the law. So it would suggest that he was a boy then.
Yeah. So
Can't remember
but
what it is now.
yeah. Anyway, so
You see, an historian wanting to study it